Eugeniusz Romer, witam Państwa z konferencji Three Seas One Opportunity. Dzisiaj moim gościem jest pan dr Thomas Wilfred O'Donnell, który jest fizykiem jądrowym, jest także ekspertem i analitykiem, jeżeli chodzi o energię i geostrategię. Pracuje w Wilson Center, ale mieszka w Berlinie. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
So, my first question is, do you think that freedom of navigation and freedom of trade is this something that is going to be sustainable in the nearest future?
Yes. However, to continue to make it sustainable, well, first I should say, after World War II, the international situation changed. The American system, you could say, changed the world. Before that, if you wanted to trade with another country, oftentimes one great power would fight for another for access to ports and so forth, and this leads to wars. So the idea was everybody should have access to everything, and the American Navy sort of guaranteed the freedom of the seas. And the problem is, in the recent years, there's been one or two players who have abused. So it's sort of like at the school, when a couple children are abusing the playground, you have to take them out of the playground or the other people can't play. And something like that is happening internationally now, especially with China as far as the seas are concerned, but Russia also.
So do you think that the Navy of the United States of America is going to provide the security of the seas, or is it going to be like in the past, so you need to have your own navy if you want to sell commodities to other countries through sea?
Well, in a sense, both are true. So if you look at the broad scope of the world, there's never been, even the British Navy at its height, a navy that was so present in all the choke points for transit in the world and all the oceans. And this has worked very well since World War II for all countries. At the same time, locally in regions, countries such as Poland or such as Germany or the Finns or the Swedes especially have quite a capacity in this regard. There's much that has to be done on the local level. And, you know, the United States Navy can't handle all these things. So each member of NATO in particular, in the Western Alliance, needs if they're on a major waterway, needs a competent Navy that matches the local challenge.
And do you think that United States is still interested in maintaining this system? So is it still beneficial for the US? Because one may say, due to shale extraction, for example, the US is self-sufficient in terms of oil, also in terms of gas. I think US is one of the most main exporters in the world, but it doesn't need it. It can work within its own economy. So do you think this is something that is still beneficial for the US?
Well, in the present era, it's no longer possible for any one country to really have energy independence. Politicians like to talk about this, right? And of course you need, like here in Poland, you need energy resilience in case your supplies were cut in a major conflict or something, of course. And we see what happened to Ukraine in that regard. But to talk about oil and gas, for example, the United States is now the biggest producer of oil and gas in the world, bigger than Russia, bigger than Saudi Arabia. However, they're not independent of the world market. We still export quite a bit of oil and import, and the price is not really a local price even. It's dependent by the flows, international flows. So I could give you, just for an example, the United States has all this fracking for oil. It's really quite cheap, very technological and like an industrial process, cheap, but it's very light oil. And it's sort of more light oil than the United States needs. So they actually export quite a bit of it and bring in heavier oil to have the right mix. So there's no way to escape it. What happens in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf, affects the price of oil everywhere in the world and the flows. And our allies also, for example, in Europe or in the Far East. And we can't, isolate. If some politician says that, they're not really being quite honest. It's a sort of populist claim.
And do you think that oil is going to be still a very important or crucial commodity in the world in the nearest future, or maybe in the upcoming decades?
So, as we all know, the problem with oil is it puts carbon dioxide in the air and it makes the world warm, and this is a serious problem. However, the dependence on oil, right now in the world, something like at least 90, maybe 92% at least of all transport of everything imaginable is dependent on oil products. So the idea to replace all this with batteries and hydrogen is a nice idea, but so far it's sort of niche applications. Short drives for people who have sufficient money for it and where you have the infrastructure. But much of the developing, well, I wouldn't even call it developing world, much of Asia, Africa, Latin America, it's just not practical. And much of Europe is not practical. So it's not clear what's going to happen. But all predictions you see going forward for at least the next 2 decades, I think the use of oil will continue expanding. And if I could just say, even at best right now, the production of, say, electric vehicles, the demand for vehicles in the world is going up. So they're lucky if they can actually supply that increased demand, but you have this massive base that's not being replaced. So this is a problem. And I think, personally, I think mass transit, much more complex mass transit will have to be part of the solution. But all this takes a lot of time.
How about atomic energy? Maybe this is a solution. But on the other hand, there's a rough discussion ongoing in European Union, for example. Shall we still use atomic energy?
Yes.
For example, the Germans or the Belgians, they turned off their plants, but they turned it on again when the war broke out. So what's your opinion on that?
Unfortunately, well, we know there was a time in the 1970s when actually energy was quite abundant. We had plenty of oil, and natural gas, a lot of natural gas was coming on the market. And this was the time of sort of a renaissance, or you could say, for nuclear energy. However, there was a couple accidents. One was a lot to do with the Soviet system, actually, and that was very bad. And there was others in the West that actually didn't cause very much, hardly any, or if any at all, casualties, actually. But you can understand why people were scared. So there was this takeoff of installation of nuclear, which was rational. In a way, this does create national energy independence because you don't have to worry about imports of oil and gas. And once the plant is paid for, it's very cheap. And it might last 60, 80 years, the plant, okay? So that was all very rational, but we had these accidents and there was a movement against it. At the same time as the movement against it, there's all this natural gas cheap coming online. So a lot of countries installed natural gas. But unfortunately, in Europe, especially in Germany, there became a bit of an extremist movement completely against it. And even during the energy war that Putin launched against Europe, the Germans followed their ideology and shut off these plants, which was hurting all of Europe, I think. And now they're really paying for it through industry. So it is possible to rapidly increase, I think, atomic energy. You don't have to change the whole grid. You don't have to have energy storage. In France, in 27 years, they built 57 plants, and this was like, in the 70s and 1980s.
And now
so
they have
we could.
the cheapest energy,
Yes,
almost the cheapest energy in Europe.
They do, and so and they're resilient. So I think this can be done, but we have an ideological problem in Europe. Well, this is still bad, and can't we do everything with renewables? But that's so complex and expensive. So.
And if it comes to renewables, do you think that it also increases the dependency on China, actually?
Yes, well, China could see ahead for where the EU was going, and the United States too, and then critical minerals, and they cornered the market. And if any other country could have, they probably would have. So here's the thing. At this conference, in fact, there's been discussion of what do we do about critical minerals. And personally, I think it's an overblown concern in that if we have a more pragmatic energy transition, we don't try to do like the Germans, and they're actually failing at it. 100% wind and solar, completely change the grid, completely make storage, and in 25 or 30 years they haven't invented a new storage, batteries, then and completely go to electric cars in 10 years, which I don't think is possible. All the projections for what you'd need in critical minerals, oh my goodness, it's many times, but that's based on this ideology, and that's not going to happen, and it's really not happening. And so it's not really so critical. If you have a pragmatic transition, every country is fine, have some oil and gas. Have some solar and wind, but not to the extent you have to change your entire grid, and the rest nuclear seems more pragmatic, and then you don't have so much of this problem, I think.
So you mentioned the critical materials. Maybe I can ask you also about the rare earth elements. So as far as I know, China is the most dominant power, holding about 60% of exports, of global exports of those elements. So that means all of the world, also Europe, but also the United States are dependent on China. So how does it shape the global geopolitics?
Okay. Yes, on the one hand, there's this scramble, and as we discussed at this conference, there's this scramble for the European Union and the United States in particular to try and produce their own critical minerals, or find countries in Asia, in Africa, or Latin America that might do it. And it's complicated, and that should be done, but I think the other key thing is to have a more realistic projection of what's needed. And if you do that, it turns out, rare earths aren't really so rare, okay? And you start to, just like in oil, everyone said the world was running out of oil. And then suddenly, the United States found as much, with the new technology, found a way to frack and get oil out, and suddenly they completely replaced the reserves they had at the beginning of the 1900s. And it's a similar thing here. There are other places where rare earths and so forth are available, and other critical minerals, and it can be developed. Not on this gigantic scale. Then you really have a problem. And people in these other countries, Asia or Latin America, Africa, will say, we don't want this huge monster project here. So I would say a more realistic transition, and pay attention to it, and you could avoid this hopefully in the future.
And the last thing I would like to discuss with you is are the relations between China and Russia, especially after the war broke out. So many analysts, they say Russia is beginning to be some kind of junior partner to China because of energy. So Russia is selling energy commodities to China because it has no other places where it can sell it. But it means it makes Russia a lot strictly dependent on China. So do you think that this is going to be some kind of unification and I would say economic annexation by Russia of Russia by China?
I'm sure this is Putin and the elites in Russia have been worried about this long time before the Ukraine war. Because if you look at the periphery, I mean, Russia is this huge country with, 11 time zones, very far from St. Petersburg and Moscow, some areas. And in those local areas, oftentimes it's Chinese or even Kazakh or other bordering countries that the business is a lot over the border. And if the central state wavers, those regions could actually end up going with other countries, China included. So Putin made, for a nationalist, he made some big blunders. He thought he could win this war quickly and not tell China about it really beforehand even, it looks like. And he screwed up. He's lost his almost entire gas, first or second greatest reserves of natural gas in the world up in northwest Siberia, and he can't export it to Europe anymore. He wants to export it to China. This is a huge, long project. It's Power of Siberia 2. And the Chinese, not only with the Russians, but in every project they have, I know from the gas and oil sector, they're rather hard-nosed. They drive a hard bargain, and especially when you're in a weak position, and Putin's in a weak position, and they're giving him a hard time. It might be built eventually. This is a 10-year project, even if they started tomorrow. So he's got a big problem, and he will become more dependent on China in this regard, and the other way, for Chinese technology for his war. But the Chinese have to be careful because of American secondary sanctions now are coming. So they have joint interests, but they also,
And what does it mean for Poland that Russia is becoming more dependent on China?
Well, the concern, of course, is that China has a huge industrial base. And Russia has also in high-tech things like chips and so forth. Okay, China doesn't have the best, but Russia really doesn't have basically anything. There's a lot of things China could do to really help the Russian military. And the Russian economy has now been transformed into a total war economy. And China could help significantly And that would be of great concern to Poland and the whole Central and Eastern Europe and the Baltic states. So, of course, anything diplomatically or other ways you can do to try and pull those apart would be beneficial. But anyways, it's not so simple. You have to face reality that these things could happen. Don't have any illusions about China.
Okay, we'll see what happens in the future.
Yeah.
I hope Poland will prevail. Thank you very much for this very interesting interview and sharing our knowledge with our viewers.
It's great to be here in Gdansk.
Thank you
I'm
very much.
Impressed by everything.
Moim gościem był pan dr Thomas Wilfred O'Donnell, fizyk jądrowy, ale także analityk, ekspert w dziedzinie bezpieczeństwa, energii i geostrategii, który pracuje w Berlinie, ale pracuje dla Wilson Center ze Stanów Zjednoczonych. Dziękuję, że Państwo byli z nami i do zobaczenia.